Hey everybody. So today we're actually going to combine two separate lectures. We're going to start off with the Antebellum Reform lecture, and we'll end off with the American Whigs. So to start with Antebellum Reform, the process of American Protestantism, it really started to come of age in the 1810s, 1820s, and 1830s. That's that process of separation of church and state that started off in the American Revolution had now been solidified. It was now complete. We had the Congregationalists in New England, which we've spent a lot of time on. We have Episcopalians in the South, and we have all these other religious denominations popping up. There's the Baptists, there's the Methodists, there's the Pentecostals. All of them, no matter what denomination, all of the Protestant religions focused on the moral character of the country. They were very worried about the spreading infidelity that was going on, and they were looking back for like a revivalism of the moral religious character that had characterized the Puritans. So revivalism provided the best way to extend those religious and moral values and build up their own church membership. The Great Awakening of the mid-18th century had shown the wonders that evangelists could accomplish, and the new revivalists of the 19th century repeated this success by greatly increasing the proportion of the population that belonged to those Protestant churches. Highly emotional camp meetings were organized by Baptists or Methodists and sometimes even Presbyterians, and they became a regular feature of religious life in the South and the lower Midwest. In these southern states, religious fervor fostered societies to improve morals, to encourage temperance, or to discourage dueling, but they usually shied away from social reforms. The conservatism of a slaveholding society in the South discouraged the radical efforts to change the world, like abolitionism. The reformist tendencies were more evident in the distinctive kind of revivalism that originated in New England and in western New York. Northern evangelists were mostly Congregationalists and Presbyterians, and they were strongly influenced by the New England Puritan traditions. Their greatest successes were not in the rural areas, but in the small to medium-sized cities. Although these northern camp meetings were not nearly as extravagantly emotional as the camp meetings of the South, the northern brand of evangelism resulted in the formation of societies devoted to the redemption of the human race in general and American society in particular. The first great practitioner of the new evangelical Calvinism was Lyman Beecher of Litchfield, Connecticut. Beginning before the War of 1812, he promoted a series of revivals in the Congregational churches of New England. Another famous and more radical revivalist was Charles Grandison Finney, a Presbyterian minister. The northern wing of the Second Great Awakening, unlike the southern, inspired a great movement for social reform. Converts were organized into voluntary associations that sought to stamp out sin and social evil and win the world for Christ. They generally believed in the perfectibility of man and thus wanted to work hard for saving those who were less than perfect. An activist and outgoing Christianity was being advanced, not one that called for a retreat from the world. Most of the converts were middle-class citizens, active in the lives of their communities. They were seeking ways to adjust to the bustling world of the market revolution that would not violate their traditional moral and social values. Their generally optimistic and forward-looking attitudes led to hopes that a wave of conversions would save the nation and the world. So let's talk about some of these antebellum reform movements. One of them was the American Bible Society, founded in 1816. This organization sought to make Bibles available everywhere, and its members distributed more than 140,000 Bibles all over the country, but especially in the West. What this also did was raise the literacy rate around the country. A lot of people who were not lucky enough to have a formal education learned how to read from the Bible. Another one of these movements was the temperance movement. Lyman Beecher himself was a big player. The temperance movement is a very good example of the extent to which the nation and its values had changed by the 1830s. In the colonial and post-revolutionary periods, Americans believed that alcohol consumption was both appropriate and it was beneficial to the health. As we talked about before, Americans drank a lot in these earlier periods. But by the second decade of the 19th century, physicians had begun to change their tune on the subject of alcohol consumption. In part, this change had to do with an increasing American taste for straight whiskey instead of grog, which was watered rum, that caused an increase in health and behavior problems in heavy drinkers. Also, it was a reaction by the middle class to the problems of drink in a workplace that the Industrial Revolution had made both more efficient and more dangerous. On-the-job accidents caused by inebriated workers were messy, shocking, and unprofitable. More and more church spokesmen and capitalists wrote about and promoted temperance, especially among the working class. The cult of domesticity renewed focus on child rearing, and it focused on the home as the appropriate place for women and homemaking as the appropriate practice for women. The movement simultaneously celebrated and restricted the roles that the true woman could play in polite society. Women were, in spite of their rarefied place in society, viewed as the keepers of the nation's moral conscience. If children are the future and women are instilling the morals into the children, then women played an important part of the future of the American society. And as a result, many women found a role in reform movements of all kinds during this period. So many women participated in the movement for humanitarian reforms. Their participation became a force for a movement to remove the political, legal, and social discrimination against them. The demand for civil rights for women caused changes in the laws in several states. In the Women's Rights Convention held in Seneca Falls in 1848, members demanded that women be given the right to vote and be allowed equal opportunities in work and education. Even though they were unsuccessful at the time, it shows the character of the reform movements in America at the time. Among the most important women in the movement were Margaret Fuller, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The first half of the 19th century also saw the expansion of both the quality and scope of public education in the United States that laid for the foundations of the modern American public school system. Many excellent private schools were founded during this period. At the same time, several states began programs of free, compulsory public elementary education. Massachusetts, under the leadership of Horace Mann, created a model system of secondary schools between 1837 and 1848. Mann was a pioneer in broadening educational curricula and in creating teacher training programs. In 1850, there were 80,000 elementary schools with 3.3 million pupils attending, and 6,000 high schools with 250,000 students attending. The period also saw the growth of higher education. Although colleges primarily remained concerned with the training of ministers, many schools began professional training programs in law, science, and medicine. In 1817, Thomas Gallaudet formed what would become the American School for the Deaf. The most vigorous of all reform movements to take place in the early 19th century was the movement to abolish slavery. No other single movement ever did as much to arouse controversy or to divide the Union. A few Americans in the colonial period objected to slavery. The most vocal and active anti-slavery people were the Quakers. A movement began in Pennsylvania to collect money in order to purchase slaves in the South and return them to Africa. The movement was doomed by two factors. One, the cost, and two, the fact that slaves generally preferred to remain in America rather than go back to Africa. By the 1790s, several anti-slavery societies existed both in the United States and in Great Britain. Many Northerners saw some Southerners had grown to believe that slavery was morally wrong. Even some slave owners, for example, Thomas Jefferson, felt that slavery was an evil, but most of them agreed that it was a necessary one. The problem is that slavery offered an alternative for free labor, which didn't exist in the South. By 1800, many Southerners had come to believe that slavery was both wrong and no longer profitable. The price of tobacco had dwindled, the land needed to rest after years of tobacco growing, and the price of obtaining and caring for slaves had grown enormously. Some of these Southern slave owners wanted to free their slaves, but were hesitant. They feared that once freed, they would be unable to care for themselves in a difficult and often hostile society. They also feared that once freed, they might be re-enslaved by unscrupulous slave dealers. The attitude against slavery almost vanished in the South with the spread of cotton agriculture and after the introduction of Mr. Whitney's cotton gin. slavery suddenly became very profitable again. While the spread of cotton agriculture grew in the South, the abolition movement grew in the North. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded. This society wanted to buy slaves, set them free, and settle them in colonies in Africa, similar to the Quakers did earlier. Again, there were two problems. One, now there were too many slaves and not enough money. Two, most American slaves were not used to the hardships of life in Africa, and two colonies were actually founded. The British Society founded the Sierra Leone colony, and the American Society founded Liberia. In many cases, the freed slaves were simply dropped off on the African coast with clothes, supplies, and building materials. They were occasionally attacked by African tribes who took all of their supplies and then sold them back into slavery. In the 1820s, Benjamin Lundy, a Baltimore Quaker, called for universal emancipation. Lundy was a moderate in his approach to the issue of slavery. He hoped to bring about the gradual emancipation of all slaves by appealing to people's moral instincts. But, while Lundy's moderate abolitionist principles would persist among some who supported the movement, a more radical brand soon appeared. In the 1830s, more militant abolitionists began to appear. William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, called for the immediate emancipation and enfranchisement of the American slave population. Garrison felt that slavery contradicted the Bible and the Declaration of Independence. Garrison and other radical abolitionists had the effect of bringing a growing number of people into the abolitionist movement. At the same time, however, militant abolition angered many pro-slavery Americans. Another spokesman for the abolitionist movement was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was himself an escaped slave. He was a most impressive spokesman. He was very intelligent, self-educated, and a gifted public speaker. Douglass condemned slavery and demanded immediate abolition and enfranchisement. By the late 1830s, the abolition movement had split into two factions. The radical abolitionists like Garrison and Douglass alienated more moderate members of the movement. Garrison had complicated the slavery issue by insisting that women be granted immediate full civil rights as well. Garrison also denounced the federal government and churches for compromising on the issue of slavery. Other abolitionists deplored Garrison's militant views. The more moderate abolitionists wanted to bring about gradual abolition through the political arena. They felt that political action and patience would make possible the end of slavery without causing damage to the social fabric of the nation, or possibly even causing the destruction of the Union. In 1840, the Liberty Party was founded. It was a moderate abolitionist political organization. The Liberty Party nominated James G. Birney, an ex-slave owner from Alabama, for president. Birney received 7,000 votes. In 1844, he ran again and received 62,000 votes out of a total of 2.5 million. The problem was that the Liberty Party had only one issue in their platform: abolition. In the early 1840s, abolition was not popular enough to get Birney elected. Some supporters of the abolitionist movement took more direct action by helping runaway slaves. These activities were the origin of the Underground Railroad. Slaves who learned about the railroad could escape and find shelter in both the North and in the South. They would be able to flee to freedom across the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line into Pennsylvania. Fleeing north did not bring slaves their freedom, however. According to the Fugitive Slave Law of 1793, owners of runaway slaves could recover their property merely by appearing before a magistrate and declaring that the captured slave belonged to them. In order to be completely free, an escaped slave had to get all the way to Canada or to Mexico. Several individuals who became important in the abolition movement had escaped from slavery. The most important were Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. At great personal risk, Tubman made several trips into the South to bring escaped slaves out to freedom. She has come to be referred to as the Moses of the abolition movement. The perils of slavery and escape from slavery were portrayed by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a northern white woman, in a book published in 1852 entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin. In the book, Stowe gave a stilted and romantic view of the slave system. The tone of the book was a moralistic one. Her narrative was very compelling. It portrayed the inhumanity of the slave system in the South. The book was applauded in the North and praised by abolitionists. In fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin became one of the most popular books in previous history. In the South, the book was bitterly denounced and presenting a false picture of the slave system. Southerners pointed out the inhuman master in the book did not give a fair picture of Southern slave owners. Southerners were especially upset because the book encouraged the support of the Underground Railroad. So Northern resistance to the abolitionist movement grew as well. Abolitionist preachers in the North were sometimes forced to quit by their congregations. Urban Northern mobs attacked Garrison and Douglas on several occasions. Prudence Crandall turned her boarding school in Connecticut into a teacher training school for black women. In turn, the community poisoned her well and tried to burn her house down. Many Northern wage earners opposed the abolition movement as well. They feared that they would have to compete against black workers if they were freed. Most Northern trade unions opposed abolition. Finally, some people, both Northern and Southern, feared that the abolition movement would eventually force the South to secede. This would destroy the Union. Reacted to the abolition movement in various ways. Many Southerners who had been in support of gradual abolition at first changed their minds when in 1831, Nat Turner led a slave revolt in Virginia in which some 60 whites were killed. Several Southern writers wrote books in which they argued that slavery was good for everybody involved. John C. Calhoun insisted that slavery was a positive good. He compared the slave system in the South to the wage labor and conditions of the worker in the North. The slaves, he said, were considerably better off. They were fed, clothed, and protected by their owner. When slaves became too old to work, the master cared for them. Northern workers, he said, worked in conditions that no Southern master would force on their slaves. When Northern workers got too old to work, they were dismissed. To some extent, Clay was right. This doesn't make slavery right, of course, but it certainly makes the Northern labor system of the 1800s very wrong. Other arguments included historical, biblical, sociological, and racial. John C. Calhoun and University of Virginia professor Thomas Roderick Dhu made a historical argument for slavery. They stated that slavery had existed in all of the great ancient civilizations. The Hebrews, the Romans, and the Greeks had slavery. Many of the great accomplishments of the ancient world were made possible by slavery. Both the Hebrews and the early Christians had slaves. If they had them, Southerners argued, then it must be okay. If slavery were sinful in the eyes of God, then surely the Bible would have condemned slavery. George Fitzhugh, a Virginia lawyer, wrote 2 influential books on the subject of slavery in the 1850s. He said that Southerners were justified in owning slaves. This was, he explained, because Africans were racially inferior to European whites. According to him, Africans were savages who were introduced to European culture and Christianity by the experience of slavery, and that, he argued, was a very good thing for the slaves. In addition to his social and racial arguments, Fitzhugh used extensive documentation to show that Southern slaves lived considerably better and longer than Northern industrial workers. This was a very popular theme among Southern rationalizers of slavery because the Northern wage system was so cruel, unfair, and unjust that its mention enabled Southerners to feel pretty smug about their own grossly cruel, unfair, and unjust labor system, as they called it, their peculiar institution. So now we'll talk about the American Whigs. And while Andrew Jackson is sometimes a puzzling figure in American political history, his challengers, the Whigs, are possibly even more puzzling. And there's 2 different outlooks, so we'll take a look at both of them. Before the 1970s, historians usually depicted the Whig Party as a party without programs or platform, devoted but to one political goal, ousting Jackson and Jacksonians from government. More recent works, though, of the 80s have taken a different view of the Whigs. So let's go to the old view. The old view, the Whigs were depicted as a party without principles or cohesive policy. They were a coalition of anti-Jackson forces consisting of 1. Conservatives who had come to resent Jackson's attacks on monopoly and his war on the Second Bank of the United States. 2. Consisted of native-born Americans who were hostile to the growing foreign-born population and wanted policies which would restrict immigration. And 3. Consisted of states' rights advocates who had left the Democratic Party in a huff over Jackson's handling of the Tariff of Abominations and the nullification crisis. And because they represented such a wide political spectrum, there was much disagreement within the Whig movement. Thus, they could never achieve any lasting political policy. Now, the new view, while more recent historians agree that the Whigs represented a coalition of Jackson opponents, they have found some ideological similarities that contrast Whigs with Jacksonian Democrats. Whigs tended to be more progressive in terms of the views on the expansion of industry and manufacturing. They supported federal funding for transportation. They were against unrestrained Western expansion, fearing that one, necessary workers would leave their jobs to farm on the cheap new Western lands, and two, that rapid Western movement would place a strain on American society in the East. Henry Clay was an important spokesman for the industrial progressive system, which he called the American system. Whigs tended to embody an urban Eastern ethic and ideology rather than the frontier ethic of the Democrats. Whigs believed that problems, personal, political, and social, should be solved through compromise rather than through violence. They were opposed to westward expansion in the 1840s because it appeared that the only means of attaining the Mexican Southwest would be through war. Because the Whigs stressed the importance of social order, they tended to be more progressive in terms of social reform than the Democrats. Jacksonians were rugged individualists who did not think that reform in such areas as prisons, help for the poor and insane, or alcoholism were problems that required outside help. Jacksonians overemphasized liberty at the expense of order. Most of the reformers in the age of Jackson were, in fact, Whigs. Whig evangelists like Joshua Giddings and Lyman Beecher stressed personal reform as a means of social reform and stressed community support as part of a wider movement toward personal and societal improvement. Additionally, many of the members of the Working Man's Party became Whigs and brought with them ideas about economic and social reform to improve the lot of the working people. Many Northern Whigs, also called the conscious Whigs, were also involved in the abolition movement and the colonization movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Lincoln, and Seward are examples. They viewed slavery as both a moral and social evil, but were also worried about free blacks as a threat to society as well. They generally supported colonization. Jackson's influence in 1836 was powerful enough to ensure the election of his candidate, Martin Van Buren, in the election of 1836. Van Buren had served Jackson as first as Secretary of State and then as Vice President. The Whigs hoped to throw the election into the House of Representatives by voting for different favorite son candidates in several areas of the country. Daniel Webster of New England, William Henry Harrison of the Northwest, and Hugh White in the Southwest. Their attempt failed miserably, and Van Buren won with little difficulty. In 1840, the Whigs based their political platform on criticism of the Van Buren administration for the way it handled the Panic of 1837. The Whigs also blamed Jackson's crippling of the Bank of the United States for the panic. So the Whigs deserted their logical leader, Henry Clay, and they chose William Henry Harrison, the hero of Tippecanoe. They presented their candidate in very Jacksonian terms. Harrison was presented as a man of the people. He was contrasted against an image of Van Buren as an Eastern aristocrat. His running mate was John Tyler. Tyler was a moderate states' rights Virginian who hated Jackson, but was not a follower of Clay and Calhoun either. The campaign was remarkable for its noise and for the incessant display of Western artifacts. The Whigs, in an effort to convince Western voters that their party was the People's Party, engaged in a constant display of coonskin caps, apple cider barrels, and miniature log cabins. In fact, neither Harrison nor Tyler were frontiersmen or poor farmers. Both were influential and wealthy planners. But, as is often the case in politics, the propaganda worked. Harrison defeated Van Buren by a narrow margin of popular votes, but Harrison swept the Electoral College 234 to 60. After only 31 days, William Henry Harrison became the first president to die in office. His vice president, John Tyler, then assumed the presidency. The new president was determined to provide leadership for his party and his nation, but several factors made this impossible. The most important were Henry Clay began to challenge Tyler for leadership of the Whigs, and Tyler disagreed with practically the entire program that the Whigs had drafted under the guidance of Henry Clay and William Henry Harrison. As soon as Congress assembled in 1841, Clay introduced a package of legislation that he insisted he and Harrison had put together. The package included a repeal of the Independent Treasury Act, a charter for a new Bank of the United States, a new protective tariff, and a system of distribution to the states of the proceeds from public land sales. The program was very much like the program of the National Republicans in 1825. Tyler consistently opposed virtually the entire Whig program. He repeatedly vetoed Clay's protective tariffs, internal improvement bills, bank charter bills, and state allotment bills. In fact, the only significant piece of legislation that Tyler signed into law was the repeal of the Independent Treasury Act and a higher tariff. After Tyler vetoed the bank charter bill a second time, his entire cabinet, except for Secretary of State Daniel Webster, resigned. Webster was busy negotiating the treaty with Britain at the time. When the treaty was finished, Webster quit as well. Tyler became a president without a party. Tyler rebuilt his cabinet by appointing what few friends he had left in Washington, and most of the new cabinet consisted of Democrats or Whigs who refused to follow Clay. Tyler found himself virtually expelled from his own party. He was at war with his fellow Whigs over domestic policy, so he turned his attention to territorial expansion and international policy. The first and most important issue that he took up was Anglo-American relations. Then he turned to the thorny question of Texas annexation. Since Texas became independent from Mexico in 1836, some Americans, and some Texans as well, desired that the Lone Star Republic become a part of the United States. Jackson had wanted Texas to join the Union, but had been unable to do much about it during his presidency. When the Texas minister in Washington proposed annexation to the administration of Martin Van Buren in 1837, the request was refused since the administration anticipated that it would lead to war with Mexico. Texas withdrew the annexation offer in 1838 and chose to exist as an independent nation, recognized by both the United States and the United Kingdom. In 1843, Britain opposed annexation, but President John Tyler decided to support it. Despite the fact that Mexican dictator Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna warned that annexation would be equivalent to a declaration of war, Tyler signed the Treaty of Annexation with Texas in April 1844. The Republic of Texas President, Sam Houston, and the Texas Congress consented to the annexation. Annexation by treaty would have been virtually impossible for Tyler to accomplish because the confirmation of a treaty requires two-thirds vote in the Senate. Too many senators from free states were prepared to resist Tyler and vote against an annexation treaty. To avoid that impasse, Tyler prompted Congress to adopt a joint resolution of both houses. A simple majority of both houses passed the resolution, and Texas became the 28th state in the Union. Annexation of Texas and a lasting peace with Great Britain were Tyler's only accomplishments as the United States' only president without a party.